3, 2, 1. Ignition. Liftoff on the flight of SAR-1. It's good to see all of you here. Can someone tell me the story of the race, the fable of the race between the tortoise and the hare? Well, I've been looking at that race, and you'll remember that in the race between the tortoise and the hare raced off to a fast early lead and thought he was going to win the race. But then the tortoise kept plugging along, and eventually the tortoise defeated the hare. When we look at the race to the moon, it has some similarities with the race between the tortoise and the hare, but it differs in some ways too. Perhaps a better metaphor might be to consider a football game in which one team leads the other team at halftime, but fails to hold the lead, and the team that trailed in the first half comes back to win the football game. October 4th, 1957, Americans awoke to astounding news. The Soviet Union had launched a satellite into Earth orbit. It was about the size of a basketball and weighed 184 pounds. And it was called Sputnik 1. The space age had begun. Americans were alarmed. The world was talking about Sputnik. In fact, I had a younger brother of a classmate who went by the name of Sputnik. They called him Sputnik Nance. The Eisenhower administration was caught off guard. The administration had ignored hints that the Soviets were building a spaceport at Baikonur. The American rocket expert Wernher von Braun had asked Eisenhower to let him build a space rocket, but Eisenhower had turned him down. Suddenly, everything changed, and fast. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev boasted that the launch of Sputnik had demonstrated the superiority of communism over capitalism. And the race was on. 30 days later, the Russians again stunned the world by launching a satellite weighing 1,120 pounds. And that satellite had a live dog aboard. The dog's name was Laika. Well, Laika survived in space until finally her air supply ran out. At this time, the United States was hoping to launch a 3-pound satellite. This just shows how far behind we were. A month after Laika's flight, the U.S. tried to launch Vanguard, but that rocket exploded. The satellite on top of the rocket blasted off from the rocket and rolled into the scrub brush at Cape Canaveral, Florida. And from the bushes, the satellite broadcast a pitiful beep, 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 and kept on beeping. President Eisenhower then asked von Braun's team to try to launch a satellite using a Jupiter-C rocket. Well, this launch succeeded 4 months after the launch of Sputnik. Von Braun became a national hero. Von Braun then was very ambitious, and he decided then he wanted to go to the moon. Von Braun was also frustrated. He knew that if Eisenhower had only turned him loose, that he could have launched a satellite a year before the Russians managed to do that. In 1959, the U.S. began making plans for manned space flights. And at that point, it named 7 test pilots as future astronauts for Project Mercury. Planes moved ahead for America's first manned space flights. And the first flight was scheduled to travel only 300 miles and to last for only 15 minutes. That spacecraft would not reach orbit. American astronauts knew that flights were dangerous. They'd seen a number of U.S. rockets explode on the launch pads. The astronauts lived with danger, but they also knew how to have a little fun and relieve some of the tension and pressure they faced. They loved fast cars, and they also liked to play pranks. One of their favorite pranks was one that I once fell for. In the prank, the victim is shown a solid wooden box and told that that wooden box contains a mongoose. And so be very careful around that box. But curiosity began to get the better of me, and I started creeping a little closer to the mongoose. Suddenly, the perpetrator of the trick flipped a switch, and a spring caused a squirrel's tail to come shooting out of the box right at the victim. Well, the astronauts also knew about that mongoose trick, and they got many laughs from it, and it certainly relieved their depression. April 12th, 1961, another shock to America. The Soviets launched cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin into space. Gagarin completed one orbit and landed safely on Russian soil. America was ready to reach space, though, and the U.S. launched 2 chimpanzees for test flights of the Mercury capsule. The astronauts wanted the chimpanzee flights to be canceled, and they were eager to move on with manned space flights. And at Cape Canaveral, the astronauts sometimes would pass the cages where these chimps were kept, and they just resented even looking at the chimpanzees because they were so eager to fly themselves. But 23 days after the flight of Gagarin, astronaut Alan Shepard woke up for a breakfast of steak, eggs, orange juice, and tea. And then he left for his rocket at 4 a.m. At that point, he squeezed into that Mercury capsule, and the astronauts often said that those Mercury capsules were so tight that they didn't get into the capsule, they put on the capsule. The launch was delayed, had been delayed a few times earlier, and it was delayed again this morning, as Shepard lay on his back for more than 3 hours. Suddenly, Shepard realized he needed to urinate. He told the flight controllers, if you can just let me out of the capsule, I'll go to the bathroom and get right back in the capsule. And they said, no, it's not quite that easy. If you get out, then we're going to have to go through all these procedures again, and this is going to be another long delay, a delay in which another piece of the spacecraft might malfunction, and that might cause another delay. You might not even get off the ground today. So Shepard said, what can I do? They said, just go ahead and urinate inside the spacesuit. If you do this, there's pure oxygen in there, and also we will turn off the electrical part of the spacesuit so it doesn't short out. So they told him, let it go. The spacesuit did absorb the urine, and everything worked out. The countdown resumed. Shepard became the first American in space on May 5th, 1961. I was in 7th grade when Shepard blasted off at 8:34 a.m. My science teacher, Mrs. Crafton, scrapped the lesson for the day, flipped on the radio, and let us listen to the broadcast. I was captivated by this. It was just wonderful. Just 3 days after Shepard's flight, he and 6 other astronauts were invited to the White House to meet the new President Kennedy. Shepard and the astronauts felt that they were being used by Kennedy, and they resented that very much. But they also sought Kennedy's support for the U.S. space program. Kennedy's administration was off to a slow start. Just 21 days earlier, Kennedy had appeared weak and indecisive in the incident with the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba. Kennedy had promised direct military action, including air cover, to ensure the success of about 1,500 Cuban rebels who were prepared to invade Cuba and overthrow Fidel Castro's government. Kennedy then approved the invasion, but at the last minute, Kennedy refused to back the rebels with U.S. air power. Castro's forces easily slaughtered the Cuban rebels. At that point, when the astronauts were invited to the White House, Kennedy wanted something to raise his flagging image among the American public and even on the world stage. Kennedy consulted space scientists and decided that the U.S. should try to beat the Russians to the moon. Just 20 days after Shepard's flight, President Kennedy boldly set a goal of sending American astronauts to the moon and returning them safely to Earth before the end of 1969. And this was a time in which the U.S. did not have a rocket strong enough to power a mission to the moon and to return the astronauts safely. Even astronaut Gordon Cooper, one of the Project Mercury astronauts, was skeptical. Gordo Cooper said that we don't have a rocket that's strong enough, we don't have a moon craft that can go to the moon, and we don't even have the ability to navigate and to do the procedures that we would need to go to the moon. It's impossible. But Kennedy was bold and he stuck to his vision. When Kennedy had his vision, he said this as the goal. Here's where he wanted to go. He wanted the U.S. to go and to be first, going to the moon. The U.S. flights continued with the suborbital flight by Virgil Gus Grissom. And you will remember that Gus Grissom is from Mitchell, Indiana. Next came the flight of John Glenn, in which he became the first American to orbit the Earth. Glenn's flight had some scary moments. The flight controllers feared that his critical heat shield had become loose on the spacecraft, and if that had happened, then Glenn would have been burned alive as his craft re-entered the Earth's atmosphere. Fortunately, the heat shield held intact, and Glenn landed safely in the Atlantic. Next came flights by Scott Carpenter, Walter Schirra, and the wrap-up of Project Mercury, with Gordon Cooper staying in space for 24 hours. My parents knew that I was enthralled with spaceflight, and they thought that maybe someday I just might work in the space program. So I was allowed to play hooky and follow Schirra's flight on TV. And my mom was a school teacher. Astronaut Deke Slayton, about this time, was grounded because of an irregular heartbeat, and he was not allowed to fly a Mercury capsule. Then Alan Shepard was grounded because of dizziness and an inner ear problem, and these two flyers were highly frustrated with their medical troubles. The Russians stayed busy at this time. The Soviet flights were lasting longer and longer, and the Soviets even put a woman cosmonaut, Valentina Tereshkova, into orbit and brought her home safely. The U.S. then moved to the Gemini program and that Gemini program put two men into a larger space capsule and blasted them into orbit with the more powerful Titan rockets. Gus Grissom helped to test the first Gemini capsule in orbit, and he also tested the capsule's ability to change its orbit during flight. So the Americans were starting to move ahead of the Russians in the ability to change the orbit during the flight. That ability to change that orbit would be needed in order for Americans to make it to the moon. And Americans also had to learn to bring two spacecraft together and link them in orbit. They hadn't achieved that yet. The Russians had a different plan originally to reach the moon. They would mechanically link two spacecraft in orbit and then make spacewalks in which their cosmonauts would transfer from a spacecraft that had been orbited from Earth, that they'd ridden into orbit on, into a waiting moon craft that had previously been orbited and been launched and orbiting with the Earth, orbiting the Earth. Sounds to me like a pretty complicated plan, but that's what they would do. Then from the moon craft, the Russians would take off for the moon, and then come back, get back in that Earth craft, and again float through space to get into the craft. The Russians knew they needed the ability to move and operate and walk in space, so they made the first spacewalk, and that one was made by Alexei Leonov. He made a short float in space. Americans didn't want to be undone. They knew that they could not have the first spacewalk, but they added a spacewalk to the plans for Gemini 4, and U.S. astronaut Ed White made the first American float in space. Next came Gemini 7. It was actually launched before Gemini 6, but the two craft were in orbit together, and they maneuvered and practiced coming together and rendezvousing in orbit, and that was a major achievement. Gemini 8 faced near disaster as a thruster struck open full of power, and that thruster threw the spacecraft into a spin, and it easily could have cost astronauts Neil Armstrong and Dave Scott their lives. But fortunately, Armstrong pulled the spacecraft out of its spins, and he quickly landed it before any more trouble could develop. Gemini 9 was unable to link with the spin stage of its rocket. A metal cover was stuck on the rocket, and the Gemini 9 spacecraft was not able to dock with the rocket. Gemini 10 and 11 were able to dock with the spin stages of their rockets, but their spacewalks that were on these missions turned out to be nightmares. The astronauts were overheating, their visors were fogging up, and they couldn't see, and they were just exhausted. Meanwhile, Gemini 12 astronaut Buzz Aldrin had been practicing spacewalks, and he came up with a new technique that made spacewalking work. So America felt pretty confident moving on into the Apollo program with high hopes. Maybe the U.S. could reach the moon in 1968 and beat President Kennedy's goal even by a year. And in the meantime, Wernher von Braun had been developing the world's most powerful rocket, the Saturn V. And he felt confident that this rocket would be more powerful than the rocket the Russians were working on, which was called N1. However, tragedy struck. The Apollo 1 astronauts, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, were training in their capsule atop the new three-stage Saturn V rocket. Suddenly, the worst possible word rang out from the capsule: fire! And in that 100% oxygen atmosphere inside the capsule, an electrical spark had struck under the seat of Virgil Grissom, and all three astronauts were unable to escape from the capsule. It would have taken them 2 minutes to get out of the hatch. They were all killed by the deadly fumes. Their bodies actually had only slight burns because they were protected somewhat by the spacesuits. So the Apollo capsule must be redesigned. 3 months later, the Russians also faced tragedy when cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov was killed when his Soyuz 1 spacecraft crashed in Russia during re-entry. After the design of the Apollo spacecraft, Wally Schirra tested the redesigned Apollo 7 craft in orbit, and Schirra became the only astronaut to fly on Project Mercury, Project Gemini, and on Apollo. The Soviets knew the U.S. timetable. 3 months before Apollo 8 blasted off, a Russian rocket was tested, but it exploded. 3 technicians on the ground were killed. A month before Apollo 8 blasted off, the Russians loaded Zond 6 with 2 tortoises, some flies, and some plants, and sent it sailing around the moon and safely back to Earth. Then came Apollo 8. The U.S. decided to try to send Apollo around the moon. Now, they wouldn't land on the moon, but they would orbit the moon for 10 times and then return safely to Earth. The astronauts later considered this decision to be the boldest one ever made by the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA. And one of the reasons is that this Saturn V rocket had been launched only twice. Once was a complete success, once was a partial success. But here it was going to be number 3 with astronauts aboard going to the moon. Apollo 8 gave us pictures of the Earth rising above the lunar surface, and that helped to spark the ecology movement that continues today. A month later, Russia decided to try to answer Apollo 8 by launching Zond 1969A. This mission was probably intended to go to the moon and go around it and come back. But the second stage of the rocket shut down, the flight was aborted. The next month, the Russians decided to launch Zond L1S1, but the first stage of the rocket failed. Then James McDivitt and his Apollo 9 crew members tested the Lunar Lander, the new Lunar Lander, in Earth orbit. Then Tom Stafford and his Apollo 10 crew members went to the moon and came within 9 miles of landing on the moon before returning to Earth. Some in NASA had thought maybe the U.S. should try to go for a landing on Apollo 10 just in case the Russians are planning a surprise for us. But it was decided the safer path was to fly Apollo 10 around the moon and come close, but not to land. Apollo 11 was scheduled to try landing on the moon. Would the Russians make a last-ditch effort to beat the Americans? Da, or yes. 13 days before Apollo 11 was to blast off, the Soviets tried to launch their powerful new N-1 rocket to the moon. The N-1 rocket would simplify the original Russian plan to have those cosmonauts have to make those spacewalks. But the first stage of the N-1 rocket failed, and it destroyed the launch complex. The Soviets' N-1L3 program was delayed for 2 years. Eventually, parts of that leftover N-1 rocket and some of the other N-1 rockets were used to make storage buildings and children's playground equipment in Russia. The Russians could still win the race to the moon, but only if the U.S. failed in its Apollo program. Apollo 11 came. Apollo 11 blasted off and headed for the moon. The Lunar Lander was using lots of fuel, and there would be only one opportunity to land. But at 3:17 p.m. on Sunday, July 20th, 1969, the Eagle lander had landed. It touched down in the moon's Sea of Tranquility, and on board were Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, while Michael Collins orbited overhead. Armstrong and Aldrin set up the U.S. flag on the moon. Later, the top part of the lander blasted off from the moon, and that launch knocked over the American flag on the moon. But at least it was Old Glory and not the hammer and sickle. So we'll take it. The astronauts returned to Earth safely. Kennedy's vision had been achieved. President Johnson had been chief executive for 5 years of our country. Then fairly new president, President Nixon, was the one who ended up greeting the three national heroes. And I think that this is a fine example of a nonpartisan transfer of power between parties in our country. An ability that seems somewhat lost today when it seems that so often one president comes in and starts undoing the work of the previous administration. Where was I when the Eagle landed? Well, I was actually in Aldrin Park having a picnic with my parents and my new girlfriend named Ruth. Where were you? Just think about it. July 20th, 1969. Sunday, July 20th, on the afternoon.
I was with my grandparents and we were watching the proceedings on TV, and my grandfather just knew that couldn't be the Lord, but let's go from the windows. They're acting in some room over there. He said.
It is still hard to believe, even today, for me. Wonderful. Did the Russians give up? Yet or no? The Soviets sent Zones 7 and 8 around the moon, but then eventually Zond 9 and Zond 10 were canceled, and later the entire Zond program was canceled. The Soviets began focusing on flights in Earth orbit, and then the Russians said they had not really been planning to go to the moon all along, but not many people believed it. I didn't believe it. I knew they were wanting to go to be first. Next came Apollo 12. Pete Conrad, Dick Gordon, and Alan Bean went to the moon. They had a smooth landing in the ocean of storms on the moon, but Bean accidentally pointed his camera at the sun and destroyed his camera. So there were no live television pictures from Apollo 12. Was I ever disappointed? It's a good thing I couldn't get to Alan Bean that day. Next was Apollo 13. Do you remember this near disaster? As Apollo 13 neared the moon, a tank exploded in the service module. Here. So there was no moon landing. In fact, astronauts Jim Lovell, Fred Hayes, and Jack Swigert retreated to the Lunar Lander and used the lander named Aquarius as a lifeboat to survive an air problem and also 38-degree temperatures before they moved back to the command module at the last minute and landed safely on Earth. Apollo 14. Alan Shepard had had surgery to eliminate his dizziness problem, and he was cleared to fly again. Apollo 14 blasted off for the moon. Shepard felt the burden of this flight because he knew that Americans' interest in space was flagging. Shepard thought the future of manned spaceflight depended on the success of his Apollo 14. On the journey to the moon, the spacecraft was unable to dock with its service module, and it had to do this in order to be able to complete the mission. Shepard asked the ground controllers whether he might make a spacewalk to go outside the spacecraft and try to physically pull these craft together and so the mission could go on. The ground controllers said no, it was too dangerous, he wouldn't let him do it. Eventually, the docking was achieved by ramming the spacecraft very hard into the docking mechanism, and everything clicked. But later, while trying to land on the moon, radar went out temporarily in the Lunar Lander. The ground controllers were prepared to scrap the plans for the landing. Shepard was very frustrated. Shepard was always very confident. He was considered one of the best flyers in the whole space program. And once, when he was a Navy test pilot, and once as a pilot and piloting a Navy craft, he had landed his spacecraft, he had landed his airplane on the deck of an aircraft carrier in a raging thunderstorm, and the thunderstorm had knocked out all the instruments on board his airplane. It was an incredible landing. but it gave him confidence that almost no matter what could happen, he could overcome it. And that's just how this brave man was. Finally, the radar returned, and the Lunar Lander was able to land near the Fra Mauro crater. At that point, fellow astronaut Ed Mitchell, who had landed with Shepard on the moon, asked him whether he would have disobeyed the ground controllers if they had said he could not land. Shepard just grinned and said, "You'll never know." What do you think? I think I know. Wow, that would have been a major thing to occur. Shepard and Mitchell pulled a golf cart-like device around the moon, and it held their tools and later stored their moon rocks that they brought back with them. And they called it a rickshaw. This rickshaw was hard to pull through the moon soil, and they were kind of frustrated with it. It made them tired. Shepard also he was playful, and he had sneaked a golf club aboard Apollo 14, or the head of the 6-iron, and 2 golf balls on that spacecraft, and took them to the moon. He connected, after he had finished his moonwalks, he connected that 6-iron head with one of the handles of the tools that he'd been using, and he hit 2 golf balls on the moon. The first swing was a near miss, and the ball just rolled a few feet away. But on the second swing, he hit the ball squarely, and it sailed far off into the distance in the moon. NASA didn't really like what he did, and that was his final space flight. And it might have been his final space flight after the golf incident anyway. Now I would like to show you something that just shows you some of the excitement of the Apollo landings. And that is that if you go nowadays into an antique store, you might see some of these Apollo glasses. Here's one for Apollo 14. So there's one for Apollo 11, 12, 13, and 14. And these were part of a promotion by an oil company at gas stations. There were lots of these made. They're very popular. They're easy to find. And actually, in terms for collectors, they don't have much value. Maybe $1 or $2 a piece, probably one. But I really like them. And so we have them for Apollo 11, 12, 13, and 14. Now, where are the glasses for Apollo 15, 16, and 17? Well, they don't exist because there was so much excitement and pride in the early Apollo missions, but then the public kind of lost support and a lot of interest. And so there are no glasses that I know of for those later missions. Next, the Russians sent 2 unmanned 8-wheeled Lunar devices to the moon. No one was on board these. Retired science writer Mark Zimmerman, who lives in Michigan now, wrote an article in which he described the Russians' Moongod as sophisticated in some ways, but rather crude in some other ways. The Moongod was controlled by the Russian scientists on Earth by remote control. That Moongod craft could only inch along. Before Apollo 15 was launched, 3 Russian cosmonauts were sent into orbit: Dobrovolsky, Volkov, and Patsayev. And they flew 24 days in space, the longest anyone had ever been in space before, on their Apollo 11, on their Soyuz 11 spacecraft. But these 3 astronauts were killed almost instantly on re-entry when their capsule lost air pressure. Now we move to Apollo 15. And on Apollo 15, science took center stage as the U.S. unveiled its lunar rover. Now that rover was a cross between a dune buggy and a golf cart. And if it went downhill on the moon, it could reach speeds of up to 11 miles per hour. Dave Scott and Jim Irwin rode that lunar lander and explored the foothills of the Apennine Mountains on the moon. And while they were on the moon, Jim Aldrin was orbiting overhead. At one point, they actually had traveled 6 miles from their lunar lander that was to take them back to link up with Apollo 15 command module and head back to Earth. Apollo 16 came along, and Commander John Young, I like that name, it's great for the SAR, and Charles Duke landed on the moon near the Descartes Mountains, while Ken Mattingly sailed overhead. These astronauts had 3 longer trips in their lunar rover. 2 weeks before Apollo 17 left for the moon, the Russians tested their N-1 rocket again. The rocket exploded, and that was the end of the Russians' effort to land a cosmonaut on the moon. Do svidaniya, or goodbye. For Apollo 17, science took center stage and the limelight as the Americans sent geologist Harrison Schmitt to the moon's surface. He traveled the lunar surface with Commander Gene Cernan, and Ron Evans orbited overhead. They had 22 hours of exploration of the moon. On December 19th, 1972, the final moon mission ended, and that was more than 45 years ago. No human has set foot on the moon for more than 45 years. Next came 3 flights of Skylab, with the longest flight lasting 84 days. Apollos 18, 19, and 20 were canceled. Eventually, Deke Slayton's doctors cleared him to fly, and he was one of 3 Americans in the crew of Apollo Soyuz, that mission with the Russians. The fellow Americans were Tom Stafford and Vance Graham. So this was a joint U.S.-Russian space flight in July 1975. One of the 2 Russians was Alexei Leonov, the world's first spacewalker. Leonov was a brilliant cosmonaut, and he also was an accomplished painter. At one time, Leonov had been scheduled to become the first cosmonaut to land on the moon, while Pavel Popovich was going to orbit overhead. But it just wasn't to be for the Soviets. Later came dozens of flights of the U.S. Space Shuttle, and eventually the International Space Station, which still circles Earth overhead. What lessons can we learn from the space program and from the race to the moon? There are several. Some that I see is that it is possible for the tortoise to overcome a big lead in the race to the moon. I think the American system of giving more freedom to the astronauts as they were flying was superior to the Russians' plan of controlling so many things from the ground and giving their cosmonauts little freedom to maneuver. I think that America had a much better plan to reach the moon without having spacewalks. And Werner von Braun's Saturn V rocket proved far superior to the Soviets' equally powerful M1 rocket. Welcome back from your voyage to the moon. I hope that you had an enjoyable trip. Thank you.